I wake up some days wishing that I could press a refresh button for the world. This is life in a global pandemic, and while you and I haven't experienced the worst of it, we've had enough. You know the risks of a disease that is spreading and the devastation that it causes and can cause. You know the loneliness and the inconvenience of isolation, and we're longing for that to end. You know the stress and the uncertainty of the way ahead. And if there was a refresh button, we'd be reaching out right now to press it. This is the world of Matthew's Gospel, a world longing to be refreshed. People were sick and suffering. It was anxious and uncertain times. People were wanting relief. And so when Jesus arrived in the world and was talking about the good life, people were drawn to him and stirred. Jesus was talking about the blessed life, about a life in the kingdom of heaven, a life of coming into and under his good rule. We've been talking about it as the good life. The world was being drawn to Jesus. But Jesus didn't just talk about a good life. Jesus actually hit the button, hit the refresh button, and life was changed. We read in chapter 8 that Jesus is coming down from the mountain and crowds are following him. Jesus just delivered the Sermon on the Mount. He's teaching about the good life and the crowd is stirred up and following him. We read in verse 2 that a man with leprosy comes to Jesus. Leprosy in Jesus' day was a horrible skin condition, a disease that meant somebody was isolated from community. They were a social outcast. Ceremonially, they were designated as unclean. They could not participate in the community or the worship of God's people. You know, there were no apps in those kind of days to track contagious diseases or anything like that. But for the leper, they had to announce when they were coming so that people could clear the path and get out of their way. Life would have been horrible for them. It would have been years since this man had any kind of meaningful contact with anybody else. No handshakes, no high fives, certainly no hugs or comfort, until he meets Jesus. He approaches Jesus and he has this humble confidence, expectation that Jesus will refresh his life. See what he says in verse 2? Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. He's not just hoping for a bath or to be hosed off with disinfectant. He is humbly expecting that Jesus will remove his suffering, that Jesus will take away the disease, that Jesus will refresh his life. And Jesus does that. Jesus even reaches out and touches him. And he says, I am willing, be clean, verse 3. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Jesus then sends him off to the priest to show that he is clean and so that he can be assessed by the priest to be truly clean. Jesus has changed this man's life. His life has been refreshed. When Jesus enters Capernaum, another life is changed. Jesus meets a centurion. A centurion is a non-Jew, a Gentile, who would not usually be in contact with someone like Jesus and his followers. This centurion is a man of authority who doesn't usually ask for things. He has authority and power to say this is how it will be. Yet he comes to Jesus humbly asking Jesus for something. We read in verse 6 that the centurion is affected by the fact that his servant is suffering terribly. And so the centurion comes to Jesus, verse 6, and says, "Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." He has this recognition that Jesus is able to do something, that Jesus is able to refresh the life of his servant. And so he comes to Jesus with this humble expectation that Jesus has the authority and the power to do something. The centurion says to Jesus in verse 8, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed." Matthew tells us something remarkable about Jesus in verse 10. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. He said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." Jesus is amazed at this man's faith. Jesus is amazed at his dependence on Jesus, the expectation that Jesus can and will heal, that Jesus can refresh lives. And verses 11 and 12, Jesus gives us a hint, a glimpse, an expectation that other Gentiles like the centurion will be welcomed into Jesus' kingdom of heaven, and some who expect to belong will be left outside. And Jesus doesn't even have to go to the home of the centurion. He doesn't need to touch the servant. He doesn't even need to see the servant. But with a word, Jesus says, "Be healed." And the servant is. His life is changed. His life is refreshed. Do you get a sense of the way in which Jesus operates in the world? Wherever he goes, lives are changing. The world is being refreshed. And so when Jesus comes to the home of Peter's mother-in-law, here she is in bed, very sick, a dire condition where she'd be expected to die. But Jesus goes to her, touches her, and her life is revived. We read then in verse 16 that people are bringing to Jesus others who are demon-possessed, people whose lives are horribly disturbed. Yet Jesus disturbs Satan's control over them, and their lives are refreshed. Again, more and more people are brought to Jesus who are sick, and he heals. Matthew gives us an important piece of commentary in verse 17. Matthew writes, "This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases." There was an Old Testament expectation, an expectation from the prophets, that a Messiah would come to God's people, and he would be a rescuer. He would refresh the world. And the way in which you would recognize this Messiah is by his healing. He would heal sickness. He would heal disease. He would revive people's lives. He would drive out demons. But the ultimate refreshment that he would bring would to bring refreshment from sin, to bring forgiveness of sin, to bring atonement through sacrifice, that he would ultimately refresh the world in its relationship with God. You see, when Matthew here mentions just one verse from Isaiah, he wants us to kind of have in mind a song, a memory verse, the wider context. We're supposed to also have in mind Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6. Do you remember it? We all like sheep have gone astray. I can hear you barring. Each of us has turned to his own way. It's a description of our sin, of turning away from God. But the Lord God has laid on him, the Messiah, the iniquity, the sin of us all. Sing Isaiah 53:6. You see, the Messiah that we're expecting to come is going to refresh the world. We'll recognize him by his healing, but he'll ultimately refresh the world in its relationship with God as he gives his life as an atonement, a sacrifice, a forgiveness for sin. Physical healing in the world then, being healed of sickness and disease, in having life revived, is then like a beta version of the refresh software that is released into the world by Jesus' arrival and Jesus' presence. And we can and will know some physical healing now, sometimes complete, sometimes partial, sometimes we've got to wait. But the ultimate release of the refreshed software, the premium upgrade, will come for all who belong to Jesus in the new heavens and the new earth. All those who belong to Jesus by faith will have a truly refreshed life into eternity. As we see Jesus changing the world, there are 2 points of application for us today. Be refreshed and live refreshed. The longing that we have in ourselves for the world to be refreshed, the longing that we have to be free of sickness and disease, to be free of pain and suffering, that longing we have to be refreshed, the starting point for that is faith in Jesus. Every time we feel that longing is a moment for us to turn to Jesus in humble, confident, expectant faith that he is the one who will refresh us and the world. Sometimes immediately, sometimes we may have to wait a little while, but we can be sure and certain that when Jesus brings the new heavens and the new earth, that everything will be put right just as he has promised. So as I wake up in the morning and I want to reach out and find that refresh button, that's a moment for me to turn again to Jesus, that my faith and confidence in him may just grow that little bit deeper and that little bit stronger. We're going to stop now and sing and reflect on a song, a very personal song for all of us, a cry out to Jesus, Lord, I need you. And as you sing and reflect, I hope it'll be a moment for you that for the longings that you have in your life, that you'll be drawn deeper and deeper towards Jesus and that he might refresh you. And join me in a little while in the next video, and we're going to talk about living refreshed.